Hello students, welcome again. Friends, in our previous videos, we discussed structuralism and post-structuralism, colonialism and post-colonialism and so many different literary movements of English literature. Today, we want to understand formalism as an important 20th century literary movement of literature and criticism. Friends, formalism is also known as Russian formalism because it emerges from from the fertile brains of some Russian scholars and critics. This literary movement or critical theory became very popular from 1910 to 1930. So you can say that formalism was a part of modernism. Formalism was a part of new criticism of the first half of the 20th century. The name itself tells us what this formalism is. Formalism, the term, comes from the word form. So, the critics who follow this theory of formalism, they focus mainly on the form, on the structure, on the text of poetry. So, they have adopted a kind of scientific and objective approach to literature while evaluating the works of art, which is known as formalism. As I told you, formalism deals with the basic form or the basic structure of poetry. In such kind of formalistic criticism, the external forces like who the author is, from which social background the author comes, during which time period the poetry was written, the author's cultural background, educational background, all such external things are completely ignored by the critics while evaluating and interpreting a work of art. Here, text is at the center, text is in the focus, right? Here, the critic focuses on the language used by the author, the grammar, the syntax, the various literary devices and all such things which we exactly find in the text. These are the things which are interpreted and evaluated by a formalist critique. Now, to understand this formalism, you need to compare the traditional criticism of the 19th century and new criticism of the 20th century. If you examine the critics like Taine, Saint-Beuve and others during the 19th century, they had adopted a kind of subjective approach. Subjective approach means personal approach. There was a French critic called Hippolyte Taine. He propounded a new theory in criticism. According to him, if you want to examine a work of art, you need to find out the race, milieu and moment of the author. Here, he wants to say that while interpreting a work of art, the critic has to find out from which tradition does the author come. What is his family background? What is his milieu or social environment, and during which time period, moment means time, during which time period the author was writing so and so work. So he believed that text plus the author and his social, educational, cultural background, all these come together to give us meaning from the text. In the same manner, if you examine the 19th century French critic Saint-Beuve, Saint-Beuve also emphasized on the study of the author's personality. Why? Because Saint-Beuve believed that every work of art is the product of the author's fertile brain or his mind. So, the author, you cannot separate the author from his works of art. So, that's why while interpreting a work of art, Saint-Beuve believed that you need to study the author's mind and personality. Right, so that is called subjective approach or personal approach in criticism during the 19th century. But friends, if we examine the 20th century, particularly the first half of the 20th century, we find a kind of objective or impersonal approach in criticism, which is known as new criticism. Now the question is why there is a change from subjectivity to objectivity. The answer is that in the beginning of the 20th century, science was developing faster, technology was developing faster, and this development of science and technology also influenced the minds of the new critics of the 20th century. So the new critics and scholars of the 20th century, they also started adopting this objective or scientific approach in criticism. T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot was one of them. He published his very popular essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, in 1919. Here, Eliot has defined poetry. According to Eliot, poetry is not the turning loose of emotions. He said that poetry does not express the poet's emotions. It is an escape moving away from the poet's emotions. He further said that poetry is not the expression of the poet's personality. It is an escape from the poet's personality. So according to Eliot, poetry is different and the poet's personality is different. Both are different. So when you are reading poetry, you need not consider the poet's mind and personality. So this is called objective approach. This is called new scientific approach in the beginning of the 20th century. T.S. Eliot was one of these new critics. In the same manner, I.A. Richards, an important critic of the 20th century, he also published The Principles of Literary Criticism in 1924, and there he argues that a text should be very closely read and analyzed without considering the external materials, the external issues like cultural or political or educational or economic conditions of the author. So, according to I.A. Richards also, text should be at the center. In the same manner, there was another critique, Roland Barthes, a French critique. He published the essay Death of the Author in 1967. There also he announced the death of the author. He believed that the moment the author, the poet, finishes his poetry, the poet is dead. So that means he wants to say that when a critic is analyzing his poetry, he doesn't have to consider who the poet is and from which background he comes. So all in all, the critics like T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, Roland Barthes, they gave more focus and importance to the study of text. Now let's come to the main discussion of Russian formalism. So first of all, let's discuss how it begins in the 20th century. Formalism in criticism as a theory was first propounded by a group of scholars, a group of critics in Russia, and that's why it is also known as Russian formalism. These members of the group, they founded Society for the Study of Poetic Language in 1916. So remember friends, this date 1916, this is considered as the beginning of Russian formalism. This society, the leader of this group was Victor Slovatsky, and other exponents and other followers of this Russian formalism, they were Yuri, Vladimir, Boris, Roman, Jakobson, and so many others who followed this Russian formalism, this theory, while interpreting the poetry of the 20th century. All these members, all these scholars and critics, they were mainly inspired by structuralism. Remember my previous video on structuralism? Structuralism was developed by Ferdinand de Saussure. Okay, so formalism was actually much influenced by the theory of structuralism and also symbolism found in the beginning of the 20th century. Now friends, this is the beginning of Russian formalism 1916. Now let's try to understand what the features of this formalism are. Remember that formalist critiques, they evaluate a work of art, they try to interpret poetry regardless of the time period. They do not consider the time period or social, political or religious connections of the text with other situations. Okay, so they believe that true meaning lies in the text only. Other external forces must always be ignored by the formalist critique. These critiques advise the critics not to become the victim of four major errors. Errors means fallacies. Okay, so they believe that there are four fallacies in criticism, four errors in criticism which we should avoid while criticizing poetry or any work of art. Number one is affective fallacy. What is affective fallacy? That means a text should not be interpreted based on a reader's response, right? So for example, a poet writes poetry and you are the reader. When you read poetry, how you respond to the text, the critic is not concerned with that. Okay, so that is number one. Intentional fallacy is number two. What the author intended, okay, what was his intention, what he meant to convey, that is also not important for a critic. A critic understands a work of art by his own thoughts, by his own senses and understanding. What the author wants to say, he has nothing to do with that. That is number two. Number three, biographical fallacy. Fallacy means error. Okay, the critic should also avoid all biographical details of the author. Means we are not, as the critics, we are not concerned with what was his education, whether in his personal life the poet was happy or sad, nothing like that. Okay, so all biographical connections must be ignored by the critique. And number four, contextual fallacy. Here the author's historical background, religious or social background, all these things must also be ignored while criticizing a work of art. So all in all, you can say that formalism, in formalism, these fallacies, these errors, they lead to subjective criticism. And new criticism is what? It is objective criticism, right? So formalism gives more emphasis on the close reading of the text, okay? And there, from the text itself, you have to derive the deeper meaning from the words, from the structure, from the forms. So what is the structure? So which things do I have? Say for example, when I am criticizing a work of art as a formalist, then what should I do? In the structure, in the form of poetry, what should I focus? Then this is the list, okay? Words, how they give us meaning, that is my job. The form of poetry means when I am interpreting poetry, I need to find out whether it is a sonnet, whether it is a ballad, ode, elegy, epic, or any other kind of, which kind of form of poetry is used, what is the shape and structure of poetry, what kind of stanzas are used by the poet, what do we find harmony of words, or do we find rhythm in the words and sentences or lines used by the poet, the rhyming scheme, the meter, okay, all these things must be focused while interpreting a work of art, and all these things come together to give us the final ultimate meaning as a whole. So text as a whole includes all these things: rhyming, meter, words and their meaning, rhythm of the words, okay, all these things come together to give us meaning. So in short, this formalism is what? Formalism is a new approach of the 20th century criticism, where more emphasis is on the text, on the form of poetry, on the structure of poetry, on the language and words used by the poet. Okay, so here it is known as objective criticism, and which is in opposition to the 19th century subjective criticism. So friends, here we end up this lecture. I hope you understood it very well. Please share this video among your friends and classmates if you really liked the video. Thank you. Thank you for watching.